Good morning. Everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, I'll apologize up front. I'm kind of under the weather, so I'll cough more than a few times probably through this presentation. But so I'm here to highlight a new watershed scale conservation initiative that Parks and Wildlife is involved. And it's focused on conservation of biodiversity, conservation of native fishes, and I think it aligns pretty well with some of the watershed protection planning processes and watershed conservation processes that all of you are involved in. And despite significant investments in native fish conservation throughout the U.S., and we're talking $1 billion spent every year on river restoration, $1.1 billion spent every year through the Endangered Species Act on fish recovery. We have not taken a single fish off of the endangered species list. Those that we have taken some fish off, but it wasn't because of delisting. It wasn't because of recovery. It was because of changes in taxonomics, or it was because they actually went extinct. And so one of the thoughts is that our conservation actions need to be implemented at watershed scales, and that's consistent with the causes of fish decline. So habitat alteration, watershed alteration, that is the principal contributing factor. There are other things that weigh in, like predation, competition, even hybridization with non-native invasives, but habitat alteration is the principal contributing factor to species declines. And rather than these single species, local habitat focused conservation actions, we're starting to look at how do we approach fish conservation at a watershed scale. And so if you look across Texas at some of the rivers that we probably consider to be some of the more pristine rivers in the state, such as the Devils or even the Pedernales or Llano, one thing that most of these rivers have in common is that functional processes within their watersheds still remain relatively intact. And a lot of these rivers are receiving increased recreational attention. If you just do a quick Google search, you'll see 20, 25 new fly fishing organizations and guide services that have popped up around the hill country in the last 5 years or so, and just a significant amount of interest. Some of the mainstream fishing magazines like Southwest Fly Fishing have highlighted fishing opportunities on the San Marcos, the Devils. Even Bassmaster has been promoting local fishing opportunities as a low-cost alternative to fishing in reservoirs and lakes, which typically involves a gas-powered motorboat and significant costs. So, with the economic setbacks that the country's had, you're starting to see more canoes and kayaks sold. And we've done some initial surveys in the state, and over the last 5 years, we've seen about a 400% increase in the percentage of Texans that canoe and kayak. So, people are identifying more with rivers in Texas, whereas at least within the fishing world, most of our freshwater fisheries were in lakes and reservoirs. And given that we only have one natural lake in the state, that there wasn't much focus on rivers. So when I talked about those natural functional processes, I was talking about things like intact watersheds, functional riparian zones that provide those connections between terrestrial and aquatic food webs and maintain natural levels of inputs of sediment and nutrients, and natural flow regimes, connectivity within the watershed, connectivity within the stream, intact food webs. And so, as we look for opportunities to really try to promote watershed scale conservation for native fishes, we found a partner in the Bass Angler Sportsman Society who recently developed in 2009 this new initiative they termed the Angler's Ultimate Challenge. And what they did was promote this program where anglers would catch keepable size of all 8 endemic black bass species. And what we're learning now is there are probably more like 20 to 30 different black bass species. There are quite a few undescribed forms that exist and really have not been heavily targeted. In Texas, I'm talking about Guadalupe bass in hill country streams. And we also have another unique form of black bass. It's only found in tributaries of the Rio Grande and across the southern plateau. And it's a form of largemouth bass, and it'll probably be described pretty soon by Dean Hendrickson at the University of Texas as a new species. But across the region, you have species like shoal bass, red-eye bass, and these are all stream fishes that have not been a major focus of the angling community because they don't really grow as large as largemouth bass, Florida largemouth bass, some of these other species, even smallmouth bass. But what we did was we partnered with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, partnered with states across the southeast and south central U.S. and developed a business plan for the conservation of these species. And for Guadalupe bass alone, we identified about $15 million needed to conserve 10 populations of Guadalupe bass across the hill country and in about 5 to 6 different watersheds. And this map shows the native ranges of these species. So you see pretty good coverage across the southeast, and this is a region of the country that really has not received a lot of funding for stream restoration, and at least funding through fish and wildlife conservation avenues. And that's due in part to the lack of an iconic species like salmon or trout in the West. And so we thought, hey, here's an opportunity to really promote conservation of southeast, south, and south central streams by focusing in on something that anglers care about, that at least our primary constituents at Parks and Wildlife care about. And we thought, maybe there's an opportunity to connect in with some of the watershed planning processes that you all are involved in. And we've done just that through this relatively new watershed planning process that started up in the upper Lena watershed. But that map it aligns pretty well with this map here, and this is a group called the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership. That's one of the fish habitat partnerships set up under the National Fish Habitat Action Plan. Anyway, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there's legislation proposed, the National Fish Habitat Conservation Act, that would guide initially $75 million annually to implement fish conservation throughout the U.S. And the Southeast Aquatic Resource Partnership covers the southeast and south central U.S. And so a lot of those dollars would be funneled through or administered by SARP. And right now their priority areas or conservation focus areas where they're guiding their dollars are in those colored polygons, and one of those represents the hill country and captures areas of the coastal plain and some areas off of the plateau, but the native range of Guadalupe bass. And so as we partnered with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to develop this watershed scale fish conservation initiative, they wanted to focus initial funds on a pilot project. And so we looked across the region, and the partner said where best to put those dollars, and there was agreement that we should focus in on Guadalupe bass in Texas. And so we received about close to $500,000 initially to put towards watershed scale conservation to benefit Guadalupe bass and other native fishes, and went through an extensive planning process with partners like the Nature Conservancy and Hill Country Alliance, Hill Country Conservancy, some other groups that are active on the plateau. And most of you are familiar with this area of the state, but we're looking at significant growth in the Austin-San Antonio corridor, 50% population growth in certain areas of the plateau by 2020, 20% in most of the other areas, but significant growth there. And so a lot of those issues that you guys deal with every day are of concern here for Guadalupe bass in terms of land use changes and alteration of flows and water quality and those sorts of things. So as we look to try to focus these dollars on a sub-watershed on the plateau, we first looked at the distribution of Guadalupe bass, and the map on the upper left represents distribution of Guadalupe bass based on historic collections, and then we build species distribution models that say, okay, well, where does suitable habitat exist for the species, and that's what that lower right map represents. And then beyond that, we don't want to invest a lot of dollars in areas that where we're not going to have sustainable populations in the future under climate change scenarios, under land use changes, human population growth, water consumption, whatever it is. We want to try to focus our dollars where we know there are going to be some long-term benefits. And what this map shows, the upper left, is that current distribution that I just showed you on the previous slide, and then the other maps on the left here. These are under two different climate change scenarios. What you might see in changes in suitable habitat for Guadalupe bass. And so, just to focus on that A2 scenario, what you see is suitable habitat shifts to the south and out onto the coastal plain. And so it brings up some really interesting questions about facilitated migration of species, or what can you do for areas that likely would not provide suitable habitat through our modeling exercise. And basically we were focused on changes in rainfall patterns, stream temperatures, things like that. So maybe there are opportunities to go into a watershed that's still relatively intact and put a lot of dollars into preservation and focus on ecosystem resiliency of habitats and flows and those sorts of things. So that further complicated our planning exercise. But some of the other data sets that we considered when we were trying to determine where to focus dollars for watershed conservation to benefit Guadalupe bass, we included the outputs from the National Fish Habitat Assessment, which was one of these, another one of these landscape modeling exercises. It associated land use changes in specific watersheds and local catchments with specific stream reaches. And so if you had a lot of lane cover that was inconsistent with functional habitats, then you would typically see that stream reach being coded as high risk of alteration, basically. And so these areas that show up in red are areas where there's a high risk of alteration. There has been high levels of alteration within the watershed, and there is high risk of stream habitats being altered as well. And so again, you see that Austin-San Antonio corridor show up in red, and the blues and purples further out west represent areas that are less likely to be impaired. And then one of the other data sets that we pulled into this planning exercise was levels of hybridization between Guadalupe bass and non-native introduced smallmouth bass. So this is, other than habitat alteration, this is one of the most significant threats to conservation of the species. And so smallmouth bass were stocked in various reservoirs and in some stream segments back in the 70s before we knew that they would hybridize with Guadalupe bass, our state fish. And so ever since we recognized that hybridization was occurring, we've been implementing what we call genetic swamping efforts, where we stock more fish than the system can handle. And the hope is that the fish that are stocked, that are genetically pure, will outcompete the hybrids that remain. And we've been doing this for about 20 years in the upper Guadalupe River with a lot of success, taking fish from 60% hybridization down to less than 5%. So what we have here on this map represents more or less levels of commitment that it would take from our agency to implement stocking programs to restore a species to what it was. And so you see some areas that are green, like the Pedernales, the San Saba, the Medina, where we still have pure Guadalupe bass. Other areas where you have lower levels of hybridization, and then areas in orange where you have pure smallmouth, and where Guadalupe bass have been completely extirpated from the system. And all this was pulled together, and we went through the Nature Conservancy's conservation action planning process, which is real similar to, I think, the planning processes that most of you are involved in. But for each of these ecological metrics that we considered in our planning, we were able to rank the current condition, which is more or less this is just an example that was pulled from a salmon restoration planning exercise. But those lines, red, yellow, green, represent different thresholds, where if it's below yellow, there's really not from a fisheries perspective, a good opportunity to restore the population. If it's above that green line, that preferred threshold, then there's a preservation opportunity. And so we went through and classified all the different sub-watersheds within the range of Guava Cubase. And this is just one example from the South Llano, but this is probably the most important slide. So here are the critical elements that we're looking for when we're trying to determine whether or not a sub-watershed is something that the Fish and Wildlife, from a Fish and Wildlife perspective, we want to invest significant resources. And we're looking for areas where natural processes remain intact, where watersheds that contain habitats that support all life history stages of the species that we're trying to preserve, watersheds that are large enough to support long-term persistence, and that's under things like climate change, where you may see changes in rainfall patterns and things like that. And then also areas where agreements can be developed with local partners, whether it be through a landowner cooperative or if it's a multi-jurisdictional area bordering another state, say the Sabine River, places like that, where you're dealing with Louisiana or Oklahoma or another state. You know, we want to be able to focus in on areas where we can reach, whether it's a flow agreement or some agreement that's going to allow these species to persist. And so that's what we're looking for. We found that in the Lena Watershed, and we focused that initial $500,000 that I talked about into stream restoration and watershed conservation projects in the North Llano, the South Llano, and then some subsequent dollars that became available. We're continuing to work our way down the watershed. We focused on the James River, the Middle Llano, and then our next round of funding will focus on the lower stretches of the Llano. And in the meantime, we had some partners in the Pedernales. Some of you guys have been involved in those discussions where they said, we really like what's going on in the Llano. We want to be involved. We want to develop our own landowner alliance and implement some of the same sorts of, you know, coordinated landscape conservation type actions. And so it looks like we're probably going to get another $300,000 out of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to put some seed money into that watershed to develop a similar process. And so the specific things that we're doing, there was a landowner alliance that had already formed there, the South Llano Watershed Alliance, so we're working to expand that group, and we put some dollars into helping them develop a watershed conservation plan. And then we've been putting on riparian workshops and Watershed BMP type workshops. And one example, last June, I guess it was, there was a 10,000 acre wildfire in the South Llano watershed, and so we partnered with a number of other different organizations to put on a fire workshop that promoted certain BMPs. And I've got a couple of slides coming up that show you some of those BMPs that were implemented as in a demonstration area. And then also we're implementing some, like I said, some riparian and in-stream habitat enhancement projects, and we're implementing this genetic restoration effort for Guava Cubase. And so this is just an example of an overgrazed area where you're seeing erosional banks and increased inputs of sediment and nutrients, and so we're trying to focus some dollars in on alternate shade water, a lot of the typical stuff that you guys have been involved in. And here's another example of what you see a lot in the hill country, a poorly designed Lowwater Crossing. We had a landowner that owned both sides of the river, had a bridge that was built previously. It blew out during a major rain event, and so this was his makeshift bridge. And you might be able to tell, but on River Ride over on this side, you can see where at higher flows, the river's flowing around, causing some bank erosion. And if you could see further downstream, you'd see some erosional banks and major changes in stream morphology. So we're bringing some new partners to the table that hadn't participated in these sorts of projects in the past, like the National Fish Passage Program. And we're actually getting federal funds to the Fish and Wildlife Service to build this landowner a new road crossing. And so as we developed this, we said, it'd be great if we could develop a set of best management practices that we could promote through these workshops, and as we provided incentives to landowners, whether it be just through technical guidance or financial incentives, something that we could point to as a list of BMPs to address some of the major impairments that we see over and over again. And so we went through this Watershed BMPs project, and you guys are familiar with all the typical BMPs, but we found over 2,000 different BMP documents that were relevant to the things that were going on just in the Llano. And so we put together this database, pulled all these BMPs together, organized them under different thematic areas, and those are all available now through a website. And we did this in a way that will hopefully facilitate project planning, and it references a lot of the funding sources, landowner incentives, technical guidance that's available through a lot of the organizations that are represented here today. So it's www.watershedbmps.com, and it's some of the bugs are still being worked out, but it's live now if you want to go check that out. And so those BMPs are being promoted through riparian workshops, similar to what was being done by the Nueces River Authority. We've now done some of these workshops in the Llano, the Pedernales, a number of other, I think the Plum Creek. Yeah, okay. And so what we try to accomplish there is not only provide and promote these BMPs to landowners, but also engage landowners in projects. And so that the money that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, most of that is being moved through our landowner incentive program and to landowners to do restoration projects.
There were quite a few riparian workshops throughout the Nueces River Basin.
So here's one example of one of the BMP. These are brush mats that were constructed on one of the properties affected by that 10,000 acre wildfire. And another photo of Tom Arsufi, I think, and some trincheras or rock fences that were constructed to try to catch some sediment as it ran off the landscape. And there's the after picture after the first major rain event, and you can see all the sediment that was captured and that didn't make its way into the river. And so anyway, a lot of other good pictures that I could have shared, but what we've tried to do is develop some demonstration sites around the hill country where we can take landowners and show them, look what we did, you could do this as well. And so some of the funding sources that, other than the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, that we've now dedicated to these types of watershed scale actions is, we have a state wildlife grant program that receives about $3 million a year to the agency with a 65-35 match, and then we've dedicated a lot of different sources of funding that you wouldn't typically have seen, I think, dedicated to these sorts of projects in the past, like sport fish restoration and the fish passage program. We got money from Anheuser-Busch, Toyota, and then there's a new farm bill program that was developed a couple of years ago, the Voluntary Public Access Habitat Incentive Program. So we competed for that and brought about $1 million to the state, and have dedicated those funds to projects in a number of different watersheds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I won't dwell on this. But we do have published scoring criteria for our landowner incentive program, and we've started to try to direct those more towards some requirements that landowners allow these sites to be used as demonstration areas, and also the watershed river connection. We've tried to promote targets for aquatic species in addition to the terrestrial species that were the focus in the past. And here's another series of slides on these conservation demonstration areas that we're trying to develop. So on the lower left here, and we're looking as you move from the bottom left corner of this image to the upper right, you're moving downstream. And bottom left here is the South Lena River State Park. Upper right is the Texas Tech University Llano River Field Station, and this is about a 4-mile segment of river where we've done some extensive habitat mapping, and what you see here on this map is bank classification. So we have a lot of these erosional banks, like what you see in that picture there, where we're trying to do some different bank stabilization techniques, and that's helping us prioritize areas. But then one of the other big things that we're trying to do is remove a poorly designed road crossing at the South Lena River State Park. And this is the typical road crossing that you see in the hill country, and traps a lot of sediment upstream, and then it's like a fire hose coming through those tunnels, and you see a lot of morphological changes downstream and erosional issues. And these don't typically last that long either, but here's a newer design that was just constructed near the Texas Tech campus in Junction on the South Llano, and it's a little closer to what we would want to allow for fish movement. And you actually have natural bed materials there, and we have a new paddling trail there, so it allows people to paddle through those tunnels. And we continue to work with TxDOT to try to improve some of these designs. But this map shows the location of that one road crossing I just showed you, and we're hoping to do a redesign, working with TxDOT. And then you see a number of different natural channel design actions that are taken here with J-hooks and cross veins and boulder fields and things that address some of the bank stress issues that we have, and provide habitat for Guadalupe bass. Some of the other things that we're trying to do in the area include placement of woody debris and boulder clusters that again provide habitat. And we've tried to take a very quantitative approach in all this. We've mapped the entire watershed using an unmanned aerial vehicle, which maybe you guys, it's been in the news quite a bit lately because of landowner concerns, but we mapped the entire South Llano River and to 7-centimeter accuracy, and then we have the entire South Llano River substrate mapped using side scan sonar. So we've overlaid those maps, and we know where every boulder field is, every vegetation bed, every log. And as we implement these actions, things like grasslands restoration to support spring recharge and bank stabilization and all these other things, we're trying to better understand cumulative ecosystem response and other factors at a watershed scale to determine whether or not this is really a direction that our agency really wants to invest a lot of dollars. So anyway, these maps, just if you're familiar with side scan imagery, you can kind of see the shadows that are produced here as the sounder bumps off of, for example, here's a log, here's another log, and here's some vegetation beds. And this is zoomed out. This is a map that was produced with these data sets, and you can see different colored segments and polygons that represent all those different habitat features that I just referenced. I mentioned the paddling trail already that's been developed, and a really cool thing that we're trying to do in this river segment is to again develop it as this conservation demonstration area. And the way we want to do that is link this paddling trail in with upland hiking trails at the park and at the campus. And the National Park Service was really promoting this kind of a program, and Dr. Arsufi competed and was awarded a technical assistance grant to have some National Park Service planners dedicated to help us develop this. And then there's another group based in Austin, American Youth Works, that we use for pretty much all of our trail building within the agency, and so we're working with them as well. And then Dave Rosgan, some of you may know that name, but he's been a lead for years in stream restoration using natural channel design concepts. And so all of these partners are being brought together to develop a master plan for this segment of river. And then we'll link in this paddling trail with the upland hiking trail. Hop out of your boat, walk along, and then you have kiosks like this one that say, before and after we had this erosional bank, now it looks like this is why we did it, here are the benefits to water quality, species habitats, that sort of thing. And so anyway, all of these things are being developed as we speak and should be completed over the next probably year and a half. And we probably have probably 8 of these types of watershed scale actions that are being taken across the state. And I wanted to highlight a couple of those. So the first was this There's one on the Llano. Another one that I wanted to highlight is in the Trans-Pecos region. And in that area we have it's over 3 million acres that's under conservation, whether it be federal lands, state lands, national park. There's on the Mexican side, there's a biosphere reserve. So we entered into an agreement with the Department of Interior, U.S. Department of Interior agencies, and some federal counterparts to do coordinated landscape conservation in this region. And a big focus of that is on native fish conservation. We have Rio Grande silvery minnow that was extirpated from Texas, and we've been over the last 6 years trying to reintroduce silvery minnow, and we found that they utilize some of these small tributaries that you see here on the map, Terlingua Creek, Alameda Creek, as refuge and spawning habitat. And then there are 4 or 5 other imperiled fishes that also use these areas. And so we've again invested. This is just from a sampling trip that was done during a snowstorm last year, and that picture, pretty much characterizes the whole trip. I mean, it was, I don't know if you guys remember, that was 2 years ago. There was a major snowstorm. It was 12 below when we were out collecting. But that's a Rio Grande silvery minnow right there. That's why we do it. But off in the distance here, you can see that hint of yellow. That's about a 2,000 acre parcel within the O2 Ranch in the Terlingua Creek watershed, and again, it moved some money through our landowner incentive program and the Fish and Wildlife Service Partners program to do some restoration. And we don't have any good data on it, but it's all anecdotal. But we saw that about 2 miles of stream began to flow again after we implemented this 2,000 acre grasslands restoration project. Another 2 miles of stream for Rio Grande silvery minnow and these other native fishes. And now we've competed for some additional funding through the Desert Fish Habitat Partnership, Desert LCC, and others to continue some of that work. And again, it's another landscape conservation initiative focused around the needs of native fishes. So lots of different partners involved, and several of you are in the room, and hopefully you're listed here. But I think there are lots of opportunities to align what we're trying to accomplish at Parks and Wildlife to benefit native fishes, and what each of you are doing in your respective areas in these watershed planning processes. And so we've begun to send more folks to some of the meetings and try to get a better handle on what you guys are involved in and where we might fit at the table, and hopefully we'll see more opportunities as we go along and see some effective collaboration. So with that, I'll take questions if there's time.
All right, let's do one question and then we're going to move through to our catered lunch. Go ahead, Rocky.
How much involvement and input has this program supplied to the SB3 process, the environmental flows process for this basin? When you talk about, restoring, the stream flows and the stream flows that you need.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our staff that go to the meetings promote the same species that I'm referring to here. And so Guadalupe bass is identified as a focal species for the Guadalupe drainage. And
so the SB3, the DBAS that's working in our work that they've done in this basin yet, but are aware of what you reference.
yeah, it's the same from our shop. It's the same people.
Okay, that's all.
Okay, I have a couple of quick announcements. We have our catered lunch here